What does it mean to be Muslim in America? We'll talk with the president of the Islamic Society of North America, who says American Muslims in particular have an enormous responsibility to live as exemplary Muslims and to demythologize Islam to the American public. Hello and welcome to Penn State Public Broadcasting's Common Ground Lobby Talk, which is produced in collaboration with Penn State's Institute for the Arts and Humanities. I'm Patty Satalia. This is an open forum, and we invite dialogue between our special guest and our live audience. Let's begin with an introduction. Dr. Ingrid Mattson is the first woman president of the Islamic Society of North America, the post she was elected to in August of 2006. Raised Catholic in Canada, she converted to Islam at the end of her undergraduate studies, then traveled to Pakistan, where she worked with Afghan refugees. In 1999, she earned her PhD in Islamic Studies from the University of Chicago and is now director of the Islamic Chaplaincy Program and professor at the McDonald Center for Islamic Studies and Christian-Muslim Relations at the Hartford Seminary in Connecticut. Thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you.
You converted from the Roman Catholic religion to Islam in your senior year in college. Converts are typically very passionate, and it's something that is very, very perplexing to many of us. Why did you convert? How did you become Muslim?
Well, I think it's important to say that when I became a Muslim, when I encountered Islam, at that point I was an atheist or agnostic or maybe just simply indifferent, not someone who was interested in religion or even had God in my life in any way. I had left the Catholic Church, left faith behind as a teenager, and never really looked back. So for me, when I encountered Islam and embraced it, it was the way for me to bring God back into my life. And I did so because of the power of the Quran and reading that and what it said to me about my place in this creation.
But you did describe yourself as a pious child, and it was a trip to Paris and then to Afghanistan to work with Afghan refugees where something happened. What was it that enhanced your vision of Islam?
Well, I first met Muslims, as far as I know, when I studied in Paris one summer, where I grew up in Canada. I don't think I knew any Muslims or even heard anything about Islam. So I was very fortunate that the first Muslims I met were students from West Africa, mostly from Senegal, who were just remarkable human beings, very dignified in the midst of great prejudice that they suffered in Parisian society. I mean, very overt prejudice and racism, but they had a dignity and a generosity of spirit that really impressed me, and that made me want to know more about them and their background. Since then, I've realized that they come from a strong West African tradition of Islamic Sufism, which emphasizes a kind of openness to others and the importance of living spiritually in everyday life. And they certainly did that, and that really opened my heart.
Interestingly enough, there are actually two converts in your family. You're one of 7, and you have an older sister who converted to Judaism. Tell us a little bit about that and what the reaction was in your household to this.
Right. I guess my family really does have a bit of a different experience than most Canadian or American families, although as our society changes and integrates, I think this is becoming more common. My sister is significantly older than I am, and she met a Jewish man and fell in love and wanted to marry him. And for the sake of the family and their future children, decided that for her to embrace Judaism would be the best thing. I think that may be one of the reasons why my family was a little bit confused when I chose to become a Muslim, because no man was involved. It was my own choice as a spiritual choice. And that surprised them because I wasn't someone who seemed to be looking for a religion, so it kind of hit them out of the blue. And not knowing any Muslims or anything about Islam, they were concerned. They didn't know what this would mean for my life, so it took a little bit of time for them to be able to be comfortable with it, realizing that it was something that that I could live and have a good life with.
Muhammad left no specific instructions about who should take over and lead the Islam, and the result was that split into two distinct groups, the Sunnis and the Shiites. What's the difference between the two, and does the Islamic Society of North America embrace both groups?
Right. Well, the major difference between Sunnis and Shiites is a theological difference based on the idea of succession to the Prophet Muhammad, and specifically who is authorized to interpret the Quran and the Islamic principles authoritatively. Shiites believe that authority was passed down to specific individuals in the Prophet's family, whereas Sunnis believe that it's the collective responsibility of the community. The Islamic Society of North America is open to all Muslims. Demographically, we are a majority Sunni. Our membership includes primarily people who were born in this country, whether they're from a Caucasian or African American community, or second generation Muslims whose parents immigrated, but they themselves were born here.
The organization itself was established back in 1963, and today you can count some 20,000 people among its members. What's the purpose or the mission of the Islamic Society of North America?
Our mission is to be a common platform for the diversity of Muslims in North America, and that includes individuals and organizations and communities. So in fact, our umbrella embraces even more than those 20,000 individual members, thousands more who are represented in the over 300 mosques and Islamic centers that are affiliated with our organization, as well as professional organizations like the Islamic Medical Association. Muslims in North America are highly diverse in terms of their outlook, background, in every aspect of demography that you could imagine. And what we seek to do is certainly provide guidance on some issues, but more than that, to provide a common platform for discussion, for dialogue, to engage all the different aspects of this community so that we can come to, if not agreement, at least come to know each other and work for some common goals.
There are some, though, and I think it's a minority, who are opposed to a woman leading this organization. And in fact, there are some who use this saying, which is ascribed to the Prophet Muhammad, which translates roughly to, whenever God wants the destruction of a people, he makes a woman their leader. How do you respond to that?
There are many, many sayings that are attributed to the Prophet Muhammad, and Muslim scholars have always looked at those and tried to sort which are authentic and which are fabricated. Many of them were fabricated for political purposes or people who wanted to support their position. The message of the Quran, which is clearly states that Muslim women can contribute to the same level and in the same way as Muslim men. We see that women had public roles during the lifetime of the Prophet Muhammad. So when we look at the preponderance of evidence, I think we have to give these other reports their
Are you
place.
saying that particular saying can't justifiably be attributed to him?
Well, this is a question of hadith scholarship, and I would defer that to those who have more who are specialists in that area, but there has been a lot of discussion about that statement and whether it in fact violates many other clear Quranic statements about gender equality, as well as other statements attributed to the Prophet Muhammad.
In your role as the president of the Islamic Society of North America, you say you have detected what you would call Muslim fatigue among North Americans. And in fact, you say, the sense I have from Americans is that they don't want to hear Muslims talking about Islam anymore. They just want us to do something to stop causing all these problems in their lives. And I'm wondering, is this the challenge for you as president? And what you're going to do to make Islam better understood among Americans?
I think the first challenge is to show that Muslims are like other people, in that we have our good guys and our bad guys. There are criminals in Muslim societies, just as there are criminals in Christian societies. The United States has around 2 million people in jail, probably most of them Christian. So we don't judge people and a civilization and a religious community by the worst of them. And I think that's the real challenge, because Americans are naturally interested in the ways that Islam is impacting their lives. And the reality is that there were people, and there have been people, who have used Islam to justify violence and terrorism, and in particular, the terrorist acts of 9/11. That's a reality, so Americans are going to be first and foremost interested in that. And they want Muslims to do something about it. We would love to do something about it, but what kind of role do we have? We have our voice, we have our writing, we have our example, but we are not ultimately in control of these people who are doing these things. And I think it's that sense of collective guilt or responsibility that we really have to try to avoid and explain to American people, and have them see that it's unfair to put that burden on us.
Terrorist killing in the name of Islam, you say, is not the true Islam. Describe the true Islam, the 5 pillars, if you will, to help explain for those who don't know what exactly the doctrine or the underpinnings are of this religion.
Well, Islam primarily is about belief in God and about the unity of God. And what that means is that Muslims recognize their limitations. That's why we try to submit ourselves and our lives to in obedience to God. And what that means is that we live our lives first in that awareness. We exhibit that through our acts of worship, as you say, the 5 pillars, praying 5 times a day, and ritual prayer, even more than that. I mean, supplications and invocations, but the ritual prayer 5 times a day, fasting during the month of Ramadan, the pilgrimage to Mecca, paying yearly a significant amount of our wealth.
In fact, 1% of your salary goes.
2.5% of a Muslim's wealth has to go annually to the zakat, to the charity. For me, I have to pay 1% of my income to the Islamic Society of North America as a member of the board. So that's an extra commitment. But all of these things are to show our gratitude to God.
Is there a question in the audience?
Yes, I wondered whether you were concerned about the potential for the radical Islam group to become involved in mosques around the United States and sort of dominate the voice of Islam in the United States, and what you and your organization could do in response to this.
That's a great question. Thank you. The challenge in American Islam in particular is that we do not have a hierarchical church structure. In fact, we have a very loose kind of voluntary association. And because of that, each community is individual. So there's no, our organization has no authority to go into any mosque and demand that they run a certain way or speak a certain way. But what we can do and what we are doing is developing a set of best practices for mosques and Islamic centers to develop guidelines for those communities, how their governance structure should work, what qualifications there should be for imams, what's the kind of training that an imam should have, and to then, once we have developed these guidelines, offer training programs. So we have a number of training programs for imams to help them understand their context, especially if they've come from another country. The reality is that many communities are still bringing imams who have been trained in other countries, who may be good preachers, they may be good theologians, but they don't understand necessarily the context of their community here. So we're putting a lot of energy into that, trying to help orient them, train them, and then ultimately and ideally have our own seminaries in this country where we can have our own children and our own young people be a generation of leaders.
You say that American Muslims have a special obligation to help stop the violence that is committed by Muslims in the name of Islam. Why do American Muslims have this special duty to do that?
Well, as I said before, we don't necessarily have any special power, but we do have an obligation because we have the freedom to talk about these issues. And the reality is that most Muslims in the world live in environments where they don't have that freedom because their political rights are suppressed, their freedom of speech is very limited, they may not have access to the resources that we have. So there's a moral obligation for us to exercise that kind of leadership. And it doesn't mean there's anything special or unique about Americans, but we have this rich diverse Muslim community. We have Muslims from every part of the world. So we can draw upon their experiences, their heritage, their perspective, and debate these issues in a way, in a free way, so that we can then encourage a discussion in other countries. The other thing is that we're Americans. We're part of this country. And the United States is heavily engaged in Muslim countries, in their economic policies, their political policies. So we also need to look at it as American citizens. How can we be a bridge of understanding between the United States, our policies, and Muslims in other countries?
You said that you previously never spoke, for example, about suicide attacks committed by Muslims in the name of Islam. What prompted a change in that? Why is that something that you do talk about now?
I think many Muslims in America, like many Americans before September 11th, were rather parochial. I mean, this is a big country and we have so many things going on here. We don't necessarily see our connection to what's going on in other countries. And my major concern as an educator and as a Muslim leader was the development of our organizations here in this country, our schools, our mosques, our associations. But when all of us were shocked by the events of September 11th, we realized that if we didn't pay attention to what was going on in the rest of the world, it would still impact us. And so at that point, we had to look closer at the kind of discourse that was happening in other Muslim countries, the way that Islam was being used to justify certain violent actions and take a stand on that. And so we proceeded to do so.
In fact, you say American Muslim leaders who oppose the oppression of Muslims on the one hand and also want to fight terrorism risk being seen as traitors by both sides. And I'm wondering if you personally have felt any backlash as a result of your outspokenness.
Muslims in other parts of the world look to us as Americans as well as Muslims, and so they want us to do something about American policy that they don't like or that they feel that negatively impacts them. Whether they understand the intricacies of that policy or not, I think, is another issue. But then on the other hand, there is an unfortunate feeling on the part of much of the American public that Muslims need to prove themselves. They're guilty until they prove that they're innocent, and that if we say something that any other American would be free to say, for example, something about the Iraq War, suddenly it's not because it's a moral issue or American issue, but because as Muslims we really don't have the interests of the United States at heart. Even though the majority of Americans in the last election, I think, showed that they were unhappy with much of the way the Iraq War is going, somehow it sounds a little bit different when it comes out of from a Muslim perspective.
Are Muslims interested in integrating, in separating, or in some way transforming Western culture to become a little more Islamic?
Yes, to all of those things. And I think this is the key, that we have to treat Muslims as individuals, not as a collectivity. Muslims represent a broad scale, a broad range of cultural and ideological positions, just as Americans do. I think when we look in the United States and the history of religious communities in the United States, we see those utopian communities that try to be somehow a presence, a spiritual presence apart from the world, to offer an alternative to the dominant culture. And then we see those who felt that it was best to live their spirituality and their ideals right in the midst of it, and to try to be part of everyday life, but be a moral voice amidst that. So I think we find the same thing with Muslims. In the United States, I would say that the majority feel that it's best to be active, to be part of everyday society, and most Muslims do that. The Muslim community in the United States is, on average, more educated and more well-off than the average American. So we see that there tends to be more assimilation in the United States. The situation in Europe is a little bit different, and many of the Muslim communities there come from countries that were colonized by the Europeans, and now there's a kind of blowback, and now these people are coming and are living in Europe, struggling with racism, struggling with European countries that are not quite as open to diversity and pluralism, perhaps, as the United States, and not quite as open to public expressions of religion as the United States. So the dynamic is significantly different, I believe, in Europe than in this country.
Okay, go ahead.
How do you advise members of your group, and particularly young people, I guess I'm interested in knowing, about dealing with that stereotype and still exercising their freedom of speech as Americans?
I'm really glad you brought up young people, because they're the ones that I'm most concerned about, and I'll tell you why.